the middle of saying thank you to all of our faculty and staff members who generously donated their time and energy to moderate sessions today and to enthusiastically mentor students on their impressive research projects. Thank you to each of our presenters from both VMI and our guests from other schools from outside VMI, both presenters and their faculty mentor for participating in our symposium today. And I'd also like to thank our administrative assistant, Ms. Bernadette O'Neill, who worked so hard behind the scenes to make sure this event was a success. And now I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Captain Frederick Walker, class of 15. Captain Walker presented his own research at the URS in 2015. It is our privilege to have him with us today to talk about how that research helped set him on a path for his life and to hear his thoughts about how research should focus on the betterment of life for everyone. In addition to being a VMI alum and a decorated veteran of the Virginia Army National Guard and the U.S. Marine Corps, Captain Walker is a minister, speaker, and mentor who is driven by a deep desire to help young adults reach their full abilities and career faith in life. Today, he will be speaking with us about the research he conducted while at VMI, which can now be found in VMI's archives. The title of his talk is Dr. Robert T. Kerlin, Research as the Catalyst for Human Flourishing. We will have time at the end of this session for a question and answer period. So if you have any questions, just hold on to those and you can submit them during the talk via the chat feature, or if you just want to wait, we can have the opportunity for you to ask questions to Captain Walker directly. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Captain Frederick Walker, class of 2015.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Lieutenant Colonel Bliss, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. I'll pause here for just a minute and give one of my fellow panelist members a chance to let me know if they can hear me okay.
I hear you just fine. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So again, as we say in the Marine Corps, no plan survives first contact, but it looks like we've arrived. Thank you all for taking the time to be here. Thank you again to Lieutenant Colonel Bliss, Colonel Fryan, for all that you've done to set this up. Thank you as well to the faculty, the staff, the superintendent, and the Dean of Academics for your investment in me during my time as a cadet. Most of you were there during that time. And then thank you also for the investment you're making in the cadets that we have at VMI right now. And I'd also like to extend a special thank you to several individuals that made my undergraduate research upon which this address is based for their investment in me. First, I'd like to thank Dr. Penny Tyson, Dr. Emily Miller, Dr. Brandon Coffey, Dr. Diane Jacob, Ms. Catherine Gilliam, and Miss Mary Clutie. Many of you won't know those individuals, but I'm forever indebted to them for their time spent with me in and out of the classroom. And then finally, I'd like to thank all the cadets and visiting students. Thank you for being here, and thank you for your commitment to the pursuit of knowledge. Dr. Albert Mohler writes in his book, The Conviction to Lead, quote, "Our actions may never reach the heights of our thinking, but you can be certain that the quality of your actions will never exceed the quality of your thinking." And with that, we'll move on to the business at hand. I think there's a high probability that each of you watching and or listening to this speech right now is asking one, if not all, of the following questions. The first is, what is human flourishing? It's in the title of this address, Robert T. Kerlin and Research as the Catalyst for Human Flourishing. What does that mean? Number two, who is Robert T. Kerlin? Who is this doctor and what did he do? And then number three, this is probably the most pressing question, especially for my STEM majors here. Why should I care? And again, more specifically, why should I care as a STEM major? Why does this matter to me? Why does this matter to you? And each of these is excellent questions and they demand a compelling answer. So that's my aim in this speech, to answer each of those questions robustly by fleshing out the following thesis. Scholarly research should be prompted by a passion for some cause to be furthered as it relates to human flourishing. By this, I mean that the most consequential research, that research which stands the test of time, is that which works to further this goal, human flourishing. So our first question again was, what is human flourishing? The National League of Nursing defines it like this: an effort to achieve self-actualization and fulfillment within the context of a larger community of individuals, each with the right to pursue his or her own such efforts. Further, it encompasses the uniqueness, dignity, diversity, freedom, happiness, and holistic well-being of the individual within that larger community, family, or population. Achieving human flourishing, therefore, is a lifelong existential journey of hopes, achievements, regrets, losses, illness, sufferings, copings, and the nurse helps the individual to reclaim or develop new pathways toward human flourishing. So for the purpose of this address, then, I mean to say that the scholar should seek to help individuals reclaim or develop new pathways to human flourishing. That is to say that personal fulfillment and full participation in their community should be the goal of research. That should be the ideal, the consequence of research to bring about those real world impacts. For this is the highest end of the pursuit of knowledge, bettering the life of our fellow man or woman. And that brings us to our second question, which has two parts. Part one, who was Dr. Robert Thomas Kerlin? Well, before coming to VMI as the department head of English from 1910 to 1921, he was a professor, minister, soldier, author, and civil rights activist, or in the words of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, he was, quote, a martyr in the cause of human freedom, end quote. Born in 1866 in Harrison County, Missouri, to Kentucky natives, he had humble beginnings. His father owned small farms which specialized in the raising of hogs and sheep, but the war between the states robbed the family of all but their land. And following his father's death in 1874, the 8-year-old Robert had to go to work on those family farms. Despite his family's financial woes, however, he was able to attend school up to 5 months each year. And at the age of 17, he finally earned his first teaching credential and began his career at a local public school. From there, at age 18, his pursuit of higher education began when he started his studies at Central College in Fayette, Missouri. Over the next several years, he completed graduate work in the fields of English, history, philosophy, and other subjects at schools to include Johns Hopkins, Harvard, and Yale, from where he eventually earned his PhD in 1906. He went on to serve as a professor of English at several institutions, including Missouri Valley College, Southwestern University, Yale, the State Normal School in Farmville, Virginia, and of course, VMI. From 1895 to 98, Dr. Kerlin served as a minister in the Southern Methodist Episcopal Church. There he participated in the compiling of a new church hymnal, and he also extended his ministry into the armed forces, where he served as a chaplain with the 3rd Missouri Volunteers during the Spanish-American War. His time in the military inspired him to write his book, The Camp Life of the 3rd Regiment, one of his many internationally acclaimed works, which, in the words of London's The Spectator, quote, no other work dealt so exhaustively and scientifically with the matters of which he wrote, end quote. Some of his other writings included The Voice of the Negro, Negro Poets and Their Poems, Contemporary Poetry of the Negro, The Church of the Fathers, Theocritus in English Literature, and finally a collection of poems known as Mainly for Myself. And now that we know who Dr. Kerlin is, or some of what made Dr. Kerlin who he was, we come to the second part of our second question. What did Dr. Kerlin do? To answer this question, we have to place ourselves in the context of early 20th century America. The New York Post puts it this way. It was called the Red Summer of 1919, named for the blood that ran through the streets of America's cities during months of racial unrest. African-American soldiers had returned home from the Great War, World War I, to a country still teeming with discrimination. And in the quest for civil rights, tensions between blacks and whites reached a tipping point. Deadly race riots broke out in over 24 cities, but one rural town, Elaine, Arkansas, would become the epicenter of the bloodshed. The violence there, lynch mobs, torture, indiscriminate murder, was so horrific that it would go down in history not as a race riot, but as the Elaine Massacre, end quote. You see, after nearly 50 years under the yoke of the quasi system of slavery known as sharecropping, many blacks in the South had simply had enough. So, violating all conventional wisdom, Robert Hill of Arkansas decided it was time to organize the sharecroppers into a labor union in 1918 in hopes of securing fair pay for the work being done on many former plantations. His hope was that by organizing, these sharecroppers could sue for damages in court those owners of land. In September 1919, the first union meeting took place, and a self-defense shooting by a group of 6 black men standing security at that inaugural meeting led to racial upheaval. During that union discussion, 2 white men exchanged fire with that security detail, leaving one of the whites dead. A false narrative spread like wildfire of blacks uprising and killing white people indiscriminately. And of course, this led to the actual indiscriminate killing of blacks. Mobs pulled people from trains across 20 killing fields. They shot and stabbed unarmed blacks in the streets and placed many residents in prison with little hope of due process. In the final analysis, there were somewhere around 5 white men killed and at least 237 black men, women, and children. In the end, 122 indictments were handed down, with 87 blacks being charged with crimes and 12 sentenced to death by the electric chair. After the NAACP came to the men's defense, the U.S. Supreme Court, in the landmark decision known as Moore v. Dempsey, ruled that the mob scenes outside of the local courthouses made an impartial hearing impossible, thereby violating the due process owed to these individuals by the 14th Amendment. And so, more than 5 years after their initial arrest, the Elaine 12, as they were known, were finally set free in January 1925. And you see, it was in the midst of this historic racial unrest throughout the South that Kerlin publishes his 1919 book, The Voice of the Negro, from Lexington, Virginia. In fact, he identifies himself as the department head of English at VMI on the book's copyright page. In the introduction, he writes these words, quote, "The fact that the Negro himself has the right to be heard in the courts of the world will not be denied except by the hopelessly prejudiced and constitutionally unjust," end quote. He hoped in this collection of Black magazine and newspaper stories to share the Negro perspective on a range of issues, from World War I to social issues and unrest, including lynchings throughout the South and the rest of America. But as if publishing this book wasn't enough, he went on, upon learning of the sentences levied against the Elaine 12, to publish his open letter to the governor of Arkansas in the anti-segregation publication known as The Nation in June 1921. In that letter, he urged Governor Thomas C. McRae of Arkansas to, quote, "take the matter into his private chamber and give it an hour's consideration as before the eternal judge," end quote. By quoting sections of the Bible, the Magna Carta, and the Bill of Rights, what Kerlin hoped to accomplish was to dissuade the governor from carrying out these planned executions. Now, when the VMI Board of Visitors learned of this letter, Kerlin was dismissed from the faculty outright later that year. Other charges levied against Dr. Kerlin included the subsequent protests of citizens of Arkansas, protests of VMI alumni in Detroit, and Kerlin's, quote, lecturing to blacks in black churches in Lynchburg, Petersburg, Norfolk, and Richmond, end quote. But even after this harsh treatment at VMI, Kerlin continued to serve as an advocate for racial equality, including his publishing in 1923 of his book, Negro Poets and Their Poems. And all of this, coupled with his activism, led to his unpopularity throughout the South. Ultimately, as the Cumberland News of Maryland reported in February 1950, however, quote, Dr. Robert Thomas Kerlin, 83, dropped dead at 7:45 o'clock last night of a heart attack on Mountain View Drive. Known primarily in this area for his work in the Socialist Party, Dr. Kerlin helped form and was the first chairman of a local chapter. He was active in labor for many years. And he was also widely known for his championship of the Negro and was in fact a member of the NAACP. He was a Quaker and belonged to the Meeting in Westchester, Pennsylvania. His interests were wide, and he authored multiple books in the areas of poetry, literature, and history. Since his retirement about 12 years ago, he has been interested in Greek literature, civic matters, and social problems. He lectured extensively in this area. Besides his widow, he is survived by 3 children, one of which is pursuing her doctorate at Stanford University in California. The body is at Hafer Funeral Home. And so this brings us to our third and final question. Why should you care? In one word, legacy. You see, one day your life will be condensed to one page in a newspaper or an obituary online or some other means of communication. And the question is, what will it say? What do you want it to say? I believe that Dr. Kerlin's obituary said exactly what he wanted, that he fought for the oppressed in the way that he thought best. But we can also answer this question of why should you care by going back to where we began with the concept of human flourishing. What was it that gave Kerlin the strength to stand amid the torrent of criticism he received publicly and no doubt privately, professionally, and personally? I believe it was his strong Christian faith solidified on the battlefields of the Mexican-American War, coupled with a commitment to the belief that everyone, including Blacks, should have the full dignity due them as people and human beings. Historic Christian belief derives this idea of the dignity of all persons from the imago Dei, the Latin term for man being made in the image of God. The book of Genesis in chapter 1, verse 27 makes this clear in saying, God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created him. It is this knowledge that propels the Christian in pursuit of the Great Commission to the nation, sharing the good news of the gospel that Jesus Christ has died for the sins of all those who turn to him in repentance and belief, and thus grants them the free gift of eternal life. And for Christians, this becomes now our fundamental identity, an identity found in the holiness of Christ, that he has accomplished what we cannot. So in him, we stand righteous before a holy and righteous God instead of unrighteous because of our sin. But see, it goes farther than simply Christianity. As Americans, we have over time determined that this dignity of all persons should be enshrined in the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Though it wasn't the original intent of the great Thomas Jefferson's words in the Declaration of Independence, we have determined that we as a nation will strive for this ideal, that it is in fact our ideal, that all men and women are created equal. But again, it goes farther than simply our Christianity or our citizenship status to the very heart of who we are as members of the VMI community. For the VMI mission is to produce educated, and honorable men and women prepared for the varied work of civil life, imbued with a love of learning, confident in the functions and attitudes of leadership, advocates of the American democracy and free enterprise system, possessing a high sense of public service, and ready as citizen soldiers to defend their nation in time of national peril. Again, this idea of dignity of all persons is enshrined even in who we are as members of the VMI community. So why should you care? Because what Dr. Robert T. Kerlin embodies in his memory and example is the very ideal to which we all strive. Again, as members of the VMI family, most of us as Americans and many of us as Christians. A commitment to others in the hope that they too will be able to enjoy all that life offers, regardless of where they are geographically, socioeconomically, racially, or based on any other identifying factor. Now, allow me to provide just 3 practical applications that I believe can be applied across the sciences, the arts, or any other field of endeavor. Number 1, demand complex answers to complex questions. During the Protestant Reformation, the reformers called this ad fontes, to the sources. Don't accept the simple answer. It may be the right one, but arrive at your conclusions with empirical research and the scientific method. Form your hypothesis, test it, and then rigorously test it again for repeatability. If you find it to be flawed, then you know that, like Thomas Edison, you haven't failed. You've simply found another way that won't work. This is what Kerlin did, and it earned him the respect of the Black community. As he wrote in his introduction to The Voice of the Negro, quote, "We have too frequent heard foolish vaunts about knowing the Negro. The context of such invariably convicting the speaker of dangerous conceit and the harsh spirit of suppression. Those who would honestly seek to know the Negro must read his papers, for it is in them that the Negro speaks out with freedom, with sincerity, with justice to himself. For there he speaks as a Negro to Negro. And he is aware that the white people do not so much as know of the existence of his papers." Again, demand complex answers to complex questions. Number 2, find your passion and give yourself over to it, because then you can make a difference through your research and writing. I love studying church history, Black history, literature, the arts. And so when I learned of Kerlin and his strength to stand, I was inspired. His example prompted me to advocate for the end of the Lieutenant General Stonewall Jackson salute. Not the removal of the statue itself, but the end to the salute of the statue. And also in advocating for the change of the Jonathan M. Daniels VMI class of 1961 Humanitarian Award to be a likeness of Daniels himself. And both of these things, I'm glad to say, happened. You see, my senior thesis gained me a meeting with then Superintendent General J.H. Benford P. III, VMI class of 1962, a man for whom I have the utmost respect. He heard my concerns and recommendations. We had a real conversation, and VMI made real changes, I believe, for the better. Your writing and research can have an impact. So again, find your passion and give yourself over to it. Finally, number 3, be willing to make a stand, and make that stand alone if you must. In the context of his VMI experience, Robert Kerlin stood alone in many ways, but that did not dissuade him from doing the right thing. Don't let it dissuade you. Take action with the facts you have, learn more over time, but take the 70% solution, because no one has all the facts at any given moment. In your life and research, meet the challenges and the uncertainties head on, And to paraphrase Teddy Roosevelt, be the man in the arena. Again, make a stand and be willing to stand alone if you must. So in closing, as an opening, I will suggest again that scholarly research should be prompted by a passion for some cause to be furthered as it relates to human flourishing. This truth is pressing and binding upon us, whether we find our identity first and foremost as Christians, Americans, or as cadets, faculty, staff, and alumni of Virginia Military Institute. For to serve and care for others is the highest of callings, whether we find ourselves in the sciences, the arts, or some other discipline altogether. This was the case for Dr. Robert T. Kerlin. His time spent studying the Black community led to his actions with them and in support of them. He opened his 1923 book, Negro Poets and Their Poems, with these words, quote, ad astra per aspera. That is the old Roman adage. Magnificent is it, and magnificently is it being these days exemplified by the American Negroes, particularly by the increasing number of educated and talented American Negroes, and most particularly by those who feel the urge to express in song the emotions and aspirations of their people. A surprising large number is this class. I would like to say this of you and to you, ad astra per aspera, to the stars through difficulties. That is the old Roman adage. Magnificent is it, and magnificently is it being displayed by the cadets of Virginia Military Institute, particularly by the increasing number of educated and talented cadets who feel the urge to express through research the emotions and aspirations of their people. A surprising large number is this class. Thank you for your time, and Raw Virginia Mill. And it looks like I don't have the permissions to see hands raised or anything of that nature. So I guess what we'll do is, if you can put your questions in the chat, I'll read from there. Right, first I've got here is, how does one go about finding their passion for research? Excellent question. One of the things I've heard that's been really helpful for me, thinking through more of my gifting and what I should pursue as a career rather than research itself, is think about what things make you upset when they're done poorly. So for example, me, when teaching is done poorly or public speaking, that irritates me. So one of the things I'm very passionate about is public speaking. And so I would say the same thing with research. Look for the thing that makes you upset when it's not told properly, whether that's history or it's a scientific question where there's something deeper, but the author didn't quite go there. And then I would also say, look at what things you're consistently drawn to, whether the books or the videos or the articles that you pick up and read when you're not being filled, when your calendar is not being filled with commitments from other sources. What is it that you find yourself drawn toward? And then lean on your faculty advisors. Right, next I see, can you give some specific examples of how research in the STEM sciences leads to flourishing? Well, thinking about some of the things I saw today, there were examples like using artificial intelligence to develop the best evacuation routes for natural disasters. Another was the proper soils for the most effective weight distribution, if I remember it correctly, for building structures. Another I saw was, thinking of STEM, the impact that the VMI system has on students over the course of their cadetship from freshman year to graduation. And then I also saw an abstract related to the amount of soybeans yielded based on the water intake. So all of those things in some way ultimately seek to benefit individuals' lives. So taking each one, for example, the idea of hurricane routes developed with artificial intelligence. What you're doing is figuring out what's the best way to get as many people as possible out of harm's way. human flourishing. We want these people to have the opportunity to live their lives out with every possible minute that they can have. Any second that we can spare, any extra time that we can add to these people's lives by avoiding an avoidable disaster leads to human flourishing. The impact of the rat line on a cadet's cadetship, the same idea. What are the potential long-term, short-term health effects? Will these have impacts over time? What is the effect on cognitive ability while they're in barracks? So again, these ideas of how does this help this person more fully enjoy their life and benefit their community and realize their purpose. Thinking of the soil distribution. If we're going to build, say, affordable housing, it's going to help if we make that affordable housing out of the best materials on the best possible foundation. And then finally, soybean yields. I think that one's fairly self-explanatory, where if we can get crop yields increased, hopefully it's a step toward ending some of the hunger experienced by other parts of the world, including America as well. So I hope that answers that question. Right, next I've got, can you talk about how you maintain your sense of enthusiasm and commitment when the going gets tough, whether it's research or in life? So for me, what I do to try to keep going when the going gets tough is I find my identity, ultimately in my Christian belief, in my belief that Christ has taken my place and my main identity is in him. So I think of texts like in the book of James, where it talks about that trials prepare you, that don't be surprised when you face various trials, but instead let those things shape you and mold you. And then believing that if God is sovereign, then he has a purpose in all that takes place. All things work together for the good of those who believe in him and are called according to his purpose, Romans 8:28 says. But also in a more militaristic, a more secular aspect, I think it comes down to knowing what is your purpose? What are you trying to accomplish? What's the end goal? I heard Admiral McRaven, the former Navy SEAL, mention a few days ago on YouTube that in SEAL training, you just take things one evolution at a time, one meal at a time, one training event at a time. And I think life is much the same way. It's, all right, we've got a child coming. Let's take this one step at a time. What do we need to get in place? Okay, there's been a fire. All right, everyone's safe. Let's call the insurance company and take it one step at a time. There's been a cancer diagnosis. Let's step back one step at a time. So I think it's those two things. It's leaning on your faith and leaning on that idea of one step at a time, that there's something on the other end of the trial. I hope that answers that question. Oh, next I see, Kerlin was a member of the Socialist Party of America. How did this shape his attitude toward racism and segregation? Excellent question. To be honest, I didn't realize that he was in the Socialist Party until I found his obituary. So sort of a long story. I was able to connect with a professor out in Arkansas that's done some research with the Elaine massacre. And he was kind enough to share with me the obituary that I read from in the speech and some other sources about what Kerlin's letter had as an impact on the community. So I have to say, I'm not entirely sure how the Socialist Party specifically affected his beliefs in racism and segregation, but my assumption is that it's his faith and his time in the military that led to his advocating against segregation throughout the South. And I think we see that in things like his membership in NAACP, as well as his lecturing to African Americans in their churches. So something at some point in his life made him think there's something that needs to be done here. And he went ad fontes again to the source, to those Black churches, to figure out what they thought needed to be done. And sorry, I don't have a better answer for that question. But that's definitely something I'll look into in my personal research. And next, I see, what would you encourage current cadets to take advantage of while here at VMI? Well, that's an excellent question. What I would say is, I tell everyone about VMI: honor, opportunity, leadership, and brotherhood and family. So the honor system, give yourself over to it. VMI won't make you an honorable person, but it gives you the opportunity to exercise your sense of honor. Take advantage of every opportunity, whether it's the clubs, shameless plug here, the Pramaji Club, which was started by the first African-American cadets in 1972, if I'm not mistaken, is alive and well on post. I know Colonel Keith Klein is one of the faculty advisors for that. So take part in the Pramaji Club, be part of the club sports, be part of the running club, the glee club, theater, NCAA athletics, whatever you find that you're interested in, take advantage of it. And then leadership. One of the things I regret not doing at VMI was pursuing more leadership positions. So use that time at VMI to fail, and it doesn't have a real world impact, so to speak. You know, you're not a leader of Marines yet, you're not a leader of sailors yet, or airmen, Coast Guardsmen. So when you fail, learn from it and make those changes and apply them in your life later on when you're in the fleet or you're in the civilian world leading in a company. And then finally, brotherhood. Build relationships with your brother rats and maintain those relationships as best you can after graduation. I had one of my BRs, my roommate from rat year in my wedding. And then one of the young men that I was able to mentor in the class behind me was my best man. So I would highly recommend stay in touch with your brother rats, build those relationships with them while you're in barracks together.
So Captain Walker, can you hear me now?
I can.
You can. I don't know what happened. I apologize for those technical difficulties.
No problem.
Time for one final question, which has been submitted in the chat, and it is, how can we pursue or promote the VMI mission under the spotlight, such as the journalism from the Washington Post that's been out recently?
Oh, excellent question. And let me read it again. How can we pursue and promote the VMI mission under the negative spotlight from journalism such as the Washington Post? I think it's, you just do what you did anyway. So I think of the Montfort Point Marines. I was privileged to meet two of those men while I was a first classman, a senior at VMI. And one of the things that the Montfort Point Marines were told by their instructors was, when you get out there in that training, you've got to prove that you're better. You don't have to prove that you're the same. You don't have to prove you're equal to the whites that you're training against. You have to prove you're better. And it's the same thing with the Tuskegee Airmen, the 761st Tank Battalion. Go down the line and you can fill in the blanks with minorities that have accomplished great things in the armed forces. But the answer to how that question applies to VMI is show that we're better. Live out the VMI mission in your life. Live out that ideal of being a citizen soldier committed to the functions and attitudes of leadership, possessing that high sense of public service with the people you meet. You don't have to change the perception of the Washington Post. You don't have to change the perception of all of America or the world. You're only responsible for changing the perception of the people you meet. So whenever someone asks you, what do you think of VMI? Tell them what you think. Don't worry about what the world thinks of VMI. Tell them what VMI meant to you and what it did for you. And I believe that if we all do that over time, the changes will come that need to come, and the changes won't come that don't need to come. And the same is true for the alumni. Once you're in the alumni network, come back to VMI. I wish I was back more. It's hard, but come back to VMI, do the surveys, do the interviews, do the things that you can do to stop the changes you don't think need to be made and to make the changes that do. And hopefully years from now, you can look back like I can on my cadetship and say, I did the best I could and I made some positive change. Excellent question. I hope that answers it.
Thank you very much, Captain Walker. I really appreciate you joining us today. And again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Almost made it through the whole day without them, but you know, you did a great job covering for me, and I really very much appreciate that. I appreciate all of the attendees, the mentors, the volunteers who have helped us with this. And I remind you to, for those presenters, to come by the VCUR offices to pick up the gifts that we have for the presenters. For those from other universities, we will be in touch with you to make sure we get those to you. And I hope everybody has a very nice and enjoyable afternoon. And that concludes the Undergraduate Research Symposium for this year. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure being here.